Hello. Hope we're all doing well.
Good afternoon, it's so good to see so many of you. Do enjoy your lunch. If you're in the cafe area, do come through and grab a seat. It's so great to see you. We're from Warwick Christian Union. My name's Caleb.
And mine's Mark.
And we're so excited to have you with us for this lunch bar. Mark, what's happening?
So we have a talk from the wonderful Chris, who I'm just about to invite up. So Chris, do you want to come up? Do you want to welcome him onto the stage? Now, we've learned a lot of interesting facts about you this week, Chris, but I've been informed that you were lying to us about one of them.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have a confession to make. I'm a pathological liar. And one of the facts that I gave you about myself this week was in fact not true. And the grand reveal, I can say, is that I'm sorry to tell you, and I only told you because I thought it would give me a great amount of clout. I didn't run One Direction Stan account with over 1.5 million followers. I hate One Direction. However, that does mean I definitely was a child model, and you all laughed again. And I suppose the question now is, why on earth should you believe another word that comes out of my mouth if I can stand on a stage and just lie to you so brazenly? And in some sense, I don't want you to trust a word that comes out of my mouth just because it comes out of my mouth. I want you to trust what I'm saying based on the truth of what you think I'm saying. I want you to look at the evidence for yourself and examine the arguments for yourself and not just believe it because the words came out of my mouth. Anyway, hello. For those of you who have not been in the tent yet, welcome to Wonder. It's a series of events put on by Warwick CU to investigate the claims of the life and the Christian faith. And today we are thinking about the future, and in particularly this question here: isn't happily ever after just wishful thinking? 36 years ago, on a cold January morning, the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. And its mission was to deploy a satellite into low Earth orbit, observe a comet, and then in order to honour teachers and inspire students from across the world, they were taking an actual school teacher into space to deliver a lesson from space. 73 seconds into the flight, however, Challenger broke apart. It suffered a catastrophic structural failure that led to the deaths of all 7 astronauts on board. And in his remarks to the United States and the world on the evening of the disaster, the US President at the time, Ronald Reagan, said this. He said, "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honoured us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God." But did they? On death, did the astronauts really touch the face of God? Reagan's remarks tapped into a Christian worldview which claims that death is not the end, that we will be raised from the dead, and we can say that because 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. But did he actually? It's an important question, because if Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, then all this talk of touching the face of God is just a nice, happily ever after that isn't really true. It would mean that Reagan's words to a grieving family ring hollow. They are meaningless platitudes in the face of unimaginable grief. And maybe more pressing for us today, if the resurrection didn't actually happen, then the basis of the Christian faith, the event on which all Christianity hangs, is in fact false. But if it is true, if Jesus really did rise from the dead at an actual point in space and time, then the way we see our lives, our death, and indeed the whole universe is changed forever. But how can anyone believe Jesus rose from the dead? Is happily ever after just wishful thinking? Is there any evidence to suggest that Christianity and the Christian story is not pie in the sky when you die, but the true story grounded on an event that took place in time and space? If you'll allow me, I'd like to start by doing a little bit of a historical case study. We're going to look at one of the stories found in the Bible. This is, you have on your tables, a thing called Uncover Mark. It's written by a guy called Mark who went around and spoke to Jesus' followers and kind of created a biography of his life. And I want you to turn to page 30 of Uncover Mark with me. And on page 30 of Uncover Mark, you'll see right at the top, it begins, has a paragraph heading called Jesus Feeds the 5,000. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read to you the whole story, but the feeding of the 5,000 is something of a famous event in the early life of Christianity because it's recorded in all four of the early biographies of Jesus' life, all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. If you have a look at the one that you've got in front of you, if you look down to the verse, the sentence with the little number 39 just above it, you'll notice that it says, "Then Jesus told them to make all the people sit down in groups on the green grass." Okay. In the equivalent story in the Gospel of John, he also notes that there was much grass. We'll take note of that. If you go back to the top of the one you've got in front of you, by the little number 31, it says, "Then, because so many people were coming and going, they hadn't even had a chance to eat." Mark notes that many people were coming and going. Well, why? When you look at the account of the feeding of 5,000 in John's Gospel, John notes that it was the time of the Passover, which is a big time of travelling in the Jewish calendar. Loads of people flock to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. So Mark notes one thing, that many people were coming and going, and then when we read John's account, he supplies us even more information that the people were coming and going because it was Passover. In John chapter 6, Jesus asks a guy called Philip where he's going to get some bread. And in Luke's account, one of the other ones, it said that the feeding of the 5,000 took place in a town called Bethsaida. In the beginning of John's Gospel, we learn that Philip, the guy who Jesus goes to say, "Where do we get the bread from?" we learn that he is from Bethsaida. And actually, what I want us to notice, that when you piece all the accounts together, you start to get a full picture. Things which are unaccounted for in one of the Gospels, they're fleshed out in another one. And so the story we have in front of us, what we see in the minor details, is that Jesus turns to men with local knowledge in order to supply some food. Okay, but what about the green grass? I said green grass, did nothing with it. The Middle East is a famously arid place. Where does all this green grass come from? Well, as I have mentioned, the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in a town called Bethsaida, which is by this red point here. For those of you on this side, it is just there, just there. And I want you to notice that just over the way from Bethsaida, there's a town here across the Sea of Galilee called Tiberias. Now, Christian unions have something of a reputation of what's called Jesus smuggling. You know, they lure you in with the promise of a free lunch, only to realise you're now listening to a talk about Jesus. Well, I'm sure one of the great draws of Warwick University for you was the promise of not studying geography and never having to meet a geographer. Well, the joke's on you, not just a free lunch, you're now in a geography lesson. Hello! I know, you thought you'd escape, but no, here you are on your precious Friday afternoon studying geography. Anyway, this is a rainfall chart of the town of Tiberias, which, as we noted, is kind of just over the sea from where the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. This is a rainfall chart. And looking at the chart, we can see that the Passover, which happens around the same time as Easter, so beginning of March, or end of March, beginning of April, you'll notice that that actually takes place after 5 months of rain. Of all the times you'd expect an arid country to have green grass, it would be at the end of the rainiest months of the year. And again, the small details seem to fit. What's my point? My point is that if the gospel accounts were made up far, far later, you would expect them to get small details like this wrong. People with no knowledge of the local geography, climate, the way that people worked, who lived where, you'd expect people making it up later to get small details like that wrong. But there are hundreds of little snippets like these in the Gospel accounts which show the Gospel writers were very familiar with the geography of the areas they were talking about and the people that they were talking about as well. Which implies that the stories weren't made up later, but originated with the earliest followers of Jesus. And now for a second I can tell you all going, hang on a second, is this man actually standing on a stage and telling us that someone rose from the dead because someone noticed that the grass was green? Really? Come on now. Do these prove that a miracle happened? Well, no, of course not. I can't prove a miracle happened to anyone. But I can say this, that for most of my life I was an atheist, and I always believed that the miracles in the Gospels could be explained by the stories having some kernel of truth, and then them just being exaggerated and expanded and repeated and retold as the years went on. The problem with that view is that you have to say that the fundamental part of the story, the main event of the story, was exaggerated and changed, but the minor, irrelevant details as the story was being passed on, they stayed the same. But by saying that the stories were exaggerated and the window dressing stayed the same, you have to say that the text was selectively corrupted. That people looked at the text and they distorted only certain bits of it. If you're the one saying that, well, the stories have been selectively corrupted, you need to account for that. You need to provide an explanation for that, because all I offer is a far simpler explanation, is that the stuff we have recorded on the books on your table is handed down to us as it was written by the people that were familiar with the area that they were talking about. But the obvious elephant in the room is this isn't actually a talk about the feeding of the 5,000, it's a talk about the resurrection of Jesus. The Christian faith stands or falls on the resurrection. An early leader of the church, a guy called Paul, said that if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, the Christian faith is futile. That if Christ hasn't been raised from the dead, I'm wasting my time here, and you are wasting your time here as well. But actually, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus and the discovery of the empty tomb, like the feeding of the 5,000, we see similar small details which lend credibility to the accounts we find written in the book. We read details that just wouldn't have been exaggerated or made up later. Details which suggest that what is written down here is what actually occurred. And if you allow me, if you turn to page number 88 of the books in front of your table. Sorry, no, page number 86. I can't read, it seems. Page number 86, right at the very bottom, underneath the heading, The Burial of Jesus. It says, it was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So, as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear he was already dead, so summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that this was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took the body down, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. And if you continue reading, you will find that 3 women discover that on the 3rd day after that Jesus was crucified, they discovered his tomb empty. So Jesus has been crucified, his body placed in a tomb, and some of his female followers are going to pay him a visit. In the little section, we see that rather than Jesus' body being in the tomb, Jesus' body is missing. And a man tells Mary Magdalene, you can flick through it at your leisure, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and a woman by the name of Salome, a man tells them that Jesus has risen from the dead. Now, if you were to say that the accounts of Jesus' resurrection were made up later, that they were embellished, that they were kind of sexed up, the inclusion of women here in the story is actually incredibly surprising. Because in Jesus' day, the testimony of women was treated with great skepticism. A first century historian by the name of Josephus, he writes, he says, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and the boldness of their sex." I know, women it seems were not to be trusted. So much so that a second century critic of Christianity, a man by the name of Celsus, he uses the fact that women discovered the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus as evidence against the resurrection. He writes, "While Jesus was alive, he was of no assistance to himself, but when dead, he rose again and showed the marks of his punishment, how his hands were pierced with nails, and who beheld this? A half-frantic woman, and some other one perhaps of those who are engaged in the same system of delusion." If you lived in the ancient world and you were trying to convince people that someone had risen from the dead, if you were making it up, women would be the last people you would choose to find the empty tomb. There would have been far more credible people to choose as your primary eyewitnesses. If you remember to the first verse I read from that little paragraph, we see that the tomb that Jesus is laid in belongs to a man called Joseph of Arimathea, and he is a high-up member of the religious council. He is the man who owns the tomb which Jesus is laid in. And compared to the women, at least in the eyes of the people who were writing, a prominent and well-respected religious teacher would have been a far more believable eyewitness. If you wanted this myth of yours to be believed and to catch on, Joseph of Arimathea is a far better candidate to discover the resurrection. And yet, every single one of the gospel accounts stress the fact that women were the ones who discovered the empty tomb. The historian and former Bishop of Durham, N.T. Wright, he notes this, that as historians we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40 or 50 years later, they would never have had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a sceptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead is like shooting themselves in the foot. The early Christians would never have made this up. Again, this doesn't prove the resurrection happened. But it does show that what was written down wasn't made up at a later time. And that what we have written down here in the books in front of us is what the earliest Christians were convinced had happened. Not only this, the initial followers of Jesus were then intensely and mercilessly persecuted, with many of the early followers losing their lives for claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, people die for things they believe to be true all the time. We see this play out every time we hear of a suicide bombing in the news. But how many times have you heard of people dying for what they know to be a lie? All the disciples needed to do to avoid persecution was admit they made the whole thing up, and yet they went to their deaths confessing that Jesus had risen from the grave. You know, I was lying about the One Direction Stan account, but if you put a gun to my head and told me, did you curate a One Direction Stan account, I would have told you no. Who would endure torture and execution for something they knew they had made up? For something they knew wasn't true? Would you do it? The disciples went to their death because they knew what they had seen with their eyes, touched with their hands, heard with their ears. A few years ago, the Christian Union at Bristol University, they hosted what was dubbed the Great Resurrection Debate. And basically they offered a cash prize to the student who could provide the best alternative explanation for the resurrection or the appearance of the empty tomb other than Jesus rising from the dead. And if you've got an alternative hypothesis or an idea about what could have happened, I really want to hear from you. Pop it on Slido, come and chat to me afterwards. I'd love to kind of discuss it. Anyway, lots of people entered this competition. And what the entrants had to do was write a 500-word theory about what they think happened that explained the empty tomb other than Jesus rising from the dead. And the CU, they put a panel together from the legal profession, none of them Christians, and it was presided over by a High Court judge to judge the best entrances. And the panel decided on the 3 best entries, and then they arranged an evening where the 3 best entries had 10 minutes to explain their theory in greater detail. And the judges would then decide which one they thought had the most credibility. And the winning entrant, he proposed an idea of what's known as the swoon theory. It's that Jesus wasn't actually dead when he was taken down from the cross, and that, having a nice nap for 3 days, he somehow felt better and he came out, and his followers thought that he'd risen from the dead. As the evening closed, as the guy was accepting his prize, a couple of interesting things happened. The High Court judge presiding over the whole thing thought all the theories were rubbish. He thought they were all rubbish and none of them really explained the facts that you find written in the accounts. But secondly, the more surprising thing is the guy, when he was accepting his prize, the winning entrant, he said, having looked at the evidence for himself, he didn't believe his own theory. He became a Christian 3 months later. Many people, initially myself included, having been an atheist for 22 years of my life, never seriously engaged with the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. They just dismiss it out of hand. But those who do let the evidence speak for themselves tend to find the same thing, that the evidence for the resurrection is compelling, and that many people have come to believe that Jesus really did rise from the dead. I've said it before, I can't prove to you that a resurrection happened, but something changed those disciples from scared followers of a failed Messiah into bold preachers of a message that took them to their deaths. For the early Christians and that guy in Bristol, and for me, the best explanation is for the evidence is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. And that the resurrection vindicates the Christian story as the story of the world. The story of a God who pursues a relationship with us, even to the cross, where he took the guilt and the shame of all our wrongdoing, all our failings upon himself in order to win back anyone and everyone who might put their trust in him. On that fateful day in 1986, Ronald Reagan remarked that the Challenger crew was pulling us into the future. And likewise, Jesus will pull us into the future and through death as well. That we too can touch the face of God if we put our trust in the one who defeated death. Jesus' physical resurrection at a point in time and space and history shows us that happily ever after is not just wishful thinking, but it's the actual ending of the story. Now, I admit that as an atheist, I responded with the exact same degree of skepticism and incredulity that many of you may still have. But the resurrection of Jesus is something wonderful. It's something that changed me forever. It offers a vision of the universe that tells us undeniably how tiny, precious, insignificant, but deeply, deeply loved we all are. A view of the world that tells us that we do belong to something that is greater than ourselves, that no matter the depths of our darkness, that not a single one of us is ever really alone. And I suppose I wish I could share that. That's the whole reason I'm here this week. I wish that everyone, even if for just a moment, could feel the awe, humility, and hope that faith in the risen Christ has given me. And that continues to be my wish. That's the hope that the resurrection of Jesus has given me for my life and the future. But what about yourselves? What does it mean for you now? And what does it mean for your future? Because finding your part in that story, it not only changes your future, but it changes your today too. And that the resurrected Jesus, extends the hand of forgiveness and friendship to anyone and everyone who would accept it. And he's extending it to you too today as well. I don't really know what you make of anything I've just said there, but I would like to make a couple of suggestions about what you could do. Firstly, if you're not really sure about anything I've just said, if you go, you've said some nice things, but you said that thing about One Direction, so I don't believe a word you're saying. if you really want to delve into whether we can trust the Gospels, can I recommend this book to you on the bookstalls? It's called Can We Trust the Gospels? It's written by a New Testament scholar called Peter Williams from Cambridge, and it really, really delves into kind of the nitty-gritty details of the Gospel and whether we can trust them as historical documents. Alternatively, maybe you're here going, do you know what, Chris, that was very interesting, but, I'd like to discuss this further with someone. You're not there yet, but I want to keep chatting. If that's you, on the feedback form on your table, or maybe underneath your bottom, there is an option here called I have more questions. Is there someone in the CU I could chat to? If that's you, why not tick that box, leave your contact details, and someone from the CU will be in contact with you. But maybe for some of you, actually, having seen the evidence and having heard lots of talks throughout the week, you're there going, actually, I think this is legit. I think this is legit, and I know enough, and I trust this Jesus enough to say yes to that offer of forgiveness. If that is you, can I encourage you to tick the Count Me In box. Count me in, and someone from the CU will be in contact with you to help you as you begin your journey following the resurrected Jesus. Thank you so much for listening to me throughout this week. Why don't you just take 1 or 2 minutes now to fill in the feedback form, and then we'll take questions from Slido. Thank you very much for listening.
Right, guys, so if you've got any more questions as we go through this question and answer session, do just whack them in on the Slido. So you can go to sly.do and put in the code 194972 and do upvote questions that you'd like to hear answered by Chris. So we are going to go. We're going to go for our first question. Can we get the Slido up?
Sorry, fantastic. Okay.
First question, we'll go for our most popular one first.
Yep.
Couldn't it be reverse psychology with Mary finding Jesus? Is it possible it was made up to show people we wouldn't make it up because it's women?
Right, good question. Couldn't it be reverse psychology with Mary finding Jesus? Is it possible it was made up to show people we wouldn't make this up because it's women? And I suppose the question is, why on earth would you want to do that? Like, seriously, like if you're wanting this thing and I want people to believe it's true, why would you then make up a story and then die for it? And the question also supposes that the people at the time would have had a very good understanding of reverse psychology. And, they're trying to trick you into believing something they want to be true, because I suppose the question is really, why would you want to do that? Like, if what the disciples stood to gain was power and wealth and control beyond their wildest dreams, yeah, of course you can understand why they'd want to do that, but that's not the case. The disciples lost their lives for claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. And the thing that I find interesting about it is that the gospel accounts were written about between 10 and 30 years after the letters of a guy called Paul, which you'll find in the New Testament. And when you read the letters of Paul, and as he talks about the crucifixion and resurrection, the thing that I find very interesting is that Paul never really discusses the women. And for me, that seems to suggest that Paul was kind of embarrassed about the fact that when Paul was given the opportunity, he chose not to mention the women because he knew the effect it would have on the credibility of his message. But when people were writing down the biographies of what happened, they couldn't help but write it down. Rather than it being made up, it's because it is what actually happened.
Thank you. I'm going to put 2 questions together. So, are there any accounts of people interacting with the resurrected Jesus? Is it not more likely that the body was taken by grave robbers, or couldn't the Romans have taken Jesus' body and hidden it?
Yeah, fantastic. It's 2 parts. So are there any accounts of people interacting with the resurrected Jesus? For example, we don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead because, Mary came to the tomb and went, oh, there's no one in the tomb, I guess he's come back from the dead then. On the bookstall, Sam hopefully is going to wave, the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, fantastic. If you are asking this question, the Gospel of John is for you, because in there is a guy called Thomas. And Thomas is a beloved disciple of every single person like myself who was a skeptic, because Jesus appears to some of his followers, and they go and tell Thomas, hey, Jesus has risen from the dead. And Thomas says, no, he didn't. And I refuse to believe it until I myself put my fingers in the holes where the nails were that he was driven into the cross. And when a spear was pierced into his side, once I've, stuck my finger in and dug around his ribs, I refuse to believe it. And he has an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus meets him and says, here, touch my hands, touch my side. And he falls down on his face and says, my Lord and my God. So this isn't just like a spiritual resurrection, an idea that they kind of conjured up to explain away their failures. But the risen Christ was someone that you could reach out and touch with your own hands. Okay. Is it not more likely the body was taken by grave robbers? Couldn't the Romans have taken Jesus' bodies and hidden it? And I suppose the question is, well, there's two questions. Who stole it? You have the Romans. Their one explanation. Well, why did they want to do that? They were quite happy to have him crucified because the discussion around Jesus was causing such a stir that it was actually making the province of Judea very difficult to control. So why would the Romans, having done away with this person who was actually causing civil unrest, then steal his body, hide it, and then not produce it, and then kind of watch as the riots, took place? So the Romans don't really seem to be a good explanation. What about the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders who didn't like Jesus? Well, they wanted him dead and gone as well. Why would they steal his body? And then, when people are going, Jesus has risen from the dead, why would they not go, well, hang on, no, we took the body out of his grave? That doesn't make sense. The only likely candidates, if the body was stolen, are the disciples themselves. But interestingly, if you read one of the gospel accounts, one of the biographies of Jesus' life, the Gospel of Matthew, right at the end, it says that that's what the Jewish leaders went round telling people, that the disciples stole the body. Now, imagine that you're the disciples. Jesus did die, he hasn't risen from the dead, and you're like, right, we need to construct a conspiracy that Jesus has risen from the dead. We steal the body, it's Passover, it's a very busy time, and we somehow manage to get the body away from Jerusalem without anyone noticing. And then you come down to write the accounts of what had happened. Would you put the conspiracy theory that you stole the body in the accounts? No, you wouldn't want people talking about that. You wouldn't mention it at all. And that's exactly what you find in the Gospel of Matthew. The disciples say that people went around saying that we stole the body. And before you say reverse psychology again, why would you want to do that? Why didn't you want to hush it up, and not ask the question? So I suppose, maybe grave robbers, but for me, none of them can provide a compelling explanation in place of the resurrected Jesus.
My microphone's gone, so I'm just going to project. You said that you used to be an atheist. Was it just believing the Bible that changed your mind? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Yeah, good question. I said I used to be an atheist. That is true. You believe it whether you want. I realise I'm not a very trustworthy person there. Was it just believing the Bible that changed your mind? Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. No, it wasn't just believing the Bible for me. I kind of came from my faith journey kind of came from a process of looking at philosophical arguments for God's existence, he, she, it, they, whatever, and then the claims that the Bible makes is that in Jesus, this God, the author of the creator of the universe, has kind of revealed himself. And in some sense, maybe it was believing in the Bible that changed my mind, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I don't actually think that's true. Because firstly, who gets to define what's extraordinary? For example, I studied biomedical science, and currently science can't account for the fact that life came from non-life. But all that would take us to believe that life came from non-life isn't some extraordinary evidence, it's just ordinary evidence. We shouldn't assess the claims of the Christian faith and Jesus in a much higher capacity than we would for any single other historical claim. Because what we're saying is that this is real, this actually happened. And if you want extraordinary evidence, what's your standard of extraordinary? For example, in the ancient world, I don't know if you've seen the film Gladiator, the emperor played by Joaquin Phoenix, Commodus, He's a real-life emperor, but everything in Gladiator is totally false. Anyway, Commodus is a real-life emperor. And what you find, bearing in mind this man is the most powerful person in the Roman Empire, what you find are just two contemporary accounts which describe Commodus actually existing. Jesus was a penniless preacher who owned nothing from the backwater of the Roman Empire, and we have 4 accounts of his life in far greater detail than you'll find of that of Commodus. Is that extraordinary? Maybe. I suppose the claim that I'm making is extraordinary claims require ordinary evidence, and not just ordinary evidence, good, solid evidence, and I would say that is what we have in the Christian faith.
And our final question for this session. Okay, if the tomb really was empty, then resurrection is the best explanation. But how can we be sure the tomb being empty is a true story?
Okay, if the tomb really was empty, and then the resurrection is the best explanation, so I suppose the question is, just because the resurrection is the best explanation, that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So, how can we be sure the empty tomb is a true story? And I suppose this comes to, how do you make decisions in your life? How do you make decisions in your life? When you, particularly in the sciences, when you assess things, the thing that you believe to be true is the thing which you think has the best evidence supporting it. And I suppose the question with this is, if the resurrection is the best explanation, how can we be sure it's true? It's sort of like, well, how can you be sure anything's true? When you think about it, when you really think, how do I define what truth is, how do I know what truth is, you don't really know what's true. What you go with is what you think best explains the evidence that you have in front of you. And rather than just going for, okay, right, the resurrection is the best explanation, but I still don't know if it's true. It's, well, that's the case for pretty much every single thing in your life. So rather than saying, oh yeah, it's the best explanation, but I'm still not sure, why not commit? If you think it's the best explanation, go for it. Jesus is holding his hands out to you. He won't fail you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Sorry, if your question was, can we just exclude supernatural explanations de facto, come and find me afterwards, because the short answer is no, and I'll elaborate why.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, for talking. If you do